So, Kaethe, I really wanted to have a chance to talk more about your interview because I actually thought it was really stunningly beautiful and very moving, and um, wanted to comment on it in various ways, one of which is to talk about the arc of it as I saw it in a very general way, and then maybe we can talk about more of the details.
Sure.
So I'll talk about the arc and then you can comment on that and then we can get into the details and we'll see how it goes. So,
and just to say, as part of my commenting, I've actually reviewed it also and thought it would be interesting to have you hear my observations of what is maybe specific to my way of working as I see it, and asking you whether you agree, you disagree. So maybe, I'll intersperse some commentary as well.
yeah, I think we probably have some overlap. So we'll just see how it goes. Because I think probably I would be remarking on specific things that I think you do also. But anyway, so first of all, just going back over what happened, I think the very first thing that happened was that you needed to stop the couple from going back over their argument. And you said, oh, I want you to know I got this. And I'm sure that that we can do something different here. You've offered such a rich description. We don't have to hear more about it. So I think that was a way of capturing the old and saying, let's put that aside. We're going to do something new. And then Jill offered this idea of a bubble of aloneness. And that was kind of the first naming from a narrative therapy perspective, the bubble of aloneness. And you turned to Mark to hear about his experience and whether it was similar. And immediately started to build this notion that they could be joined rather than separated by this experience of illness and the way it captured Jill in a bubble of aloneness. And I think what developed was that there were things Jill wanted Mark to get, but in his attempt to be helpful, he was not able to get these things. And you asked everybody to kind of go inside and check in with themselves to see, what they were experiencing. And I think that was a way of slowing everybody down. And out of that, Jill came up with this feeling of being I'm sort of a big nobody right now. And you really said that over and over. You really named it and made it live and said, does this crystallize what you want Mark to understand? And I think, again, Mark was going to say something like, you anticipated that Mark would say, oh, no, I don't think you're that way. You said the temptation is to say no. And then you reframed it, I think, as, she's asking you, she's extending an invitation, she's giving you permission to hear how she is, what it's like for her. So you again were taking a interaction that was going awry, where she would feel terrible and he was saying, oh no, you should take an antidepressant and so on. And you were saying, she wants you to join her in understanding this experience. And I think when you slowed them down, there was a moment where you said, I got teary. It's moving when someone is that clear about how changed and altered they feel in this illness experience. And then you turned to Mark and asked him if he could join her, what would it be like for him to join her in that moment. and he said he was scared. And again, you were suggesting that this was like a real opportunity to be together, that they didn't have to do anything about it, but they could be together. They didn't have to be disconnected by this illness experience. And you emphasized how open Jill was to Mark joining her there. And you said something quite powerful about how there's something about Jill being so open to you that transcends the difficulty, which again, I think you're starting to build a story about there's this difficulty, but there's something else possible, which to me is in narrative terms, sort of the problem and the possibility, juxtaposing. And so you were saying, you could be vulnerable together and share the meaning and feel connected, which I know reminds me of your paper on intimacy and what is an intimate interaction. And that even though they can't solve the problem of her illness, they can come together. He can witness her, he can join her in the experience, and there can be a feeling of not being alone. They can be connected. And, there was this very sweet moment where Mark said he felt inadequate. He couldn't do anything. He missed Jill. And Jill said, I miss Jill. Or maybe you said, Jill misses Jill.
Yeah,
yeah. And Jill said, when she heard, she said, I miss me too, after you said, Jill misses Jill, I miss me too. And she said that it helps her to feel more accepting of her new me when she felt that she was seen by you and seen by Mark. So I think what's happening is not only are you building a sense of a vision for possibility, but you're beginning to develop a way for them to be together with this. And you say something about, most of us don't prepare for this, which I thought was really right. We're all not ready for illness, and we don't know. There's no way to prepare for it, really. Once you're there, you have to deal with it. And you asked them, are there things you've discovered that are ways you can have an experience of being together and feel together, which is a way, it's kind of an embedded suggestion, like, maybe you could do this. Have you done it? And kind of a narrative terms like, are there ever moments when you've done this or you've discovered this? And Jill, they talked a little bit about some limited ways that they could do that, because she goes to bed early and he late, and maybe they could try to do something together. Then there's this moment where Jill puts her hand to her face, and you say, what's going on? And she's saying she feels sad but grateful for this opening. So she's beginning to feel differently in the conversation, because she feels that she's been seen by you. She's been seen by Mark. She's not so alone with her experience. And then you kind of push it. You say, hey, it can be wonderful to realize together that you're in a new place. In other words, again, you're sort of reinforcing this notion of that if you share it, it can be something different from being alone. And you say something about how certainty is a delusion for all of us, and sometimes we bump up against it, and that we're all going to have to live with uncertainty at some point. But when illness comes, and you said there's something to be said for living with uncertainty. I think there's something, you ask everybody to take a moment and check in, and when they come back after they've looked into themselves, Mark says, I see that I've made things worse in the way I've reacted to this. And he sees that if he didn't push her so hard and he could be with her, it might be different. And so I think that the naming of uncertainty as a place to explore and develop ideas about and adventure becomes sort of this new naming, the name of the alternative, which is embracing uncertainty together. So maybe that's more detailed than I thought it was going to be. I apologize. I couldn't do exactly what I had hoped to do, but that's kind of what I had in mind to say, that, it felt to me like you took, the bubble of aloneness first as a naming. You stopped the old conversation. You moved toward suggesting, could they be together in this, and could they? And then Jill came up with this other naming of, I feel like a big fat nobody or a big nobody. And you really highlighted that and brought Mark in to join her in that, and allow her not to feel so alone in that. And then began to identify it as a journey they could take together, where they could feel, she could feel seen, and he could feel like he was actually seeing her, and that they could explore what was possible given the sort of existential reality of uncertainty.
So, as you predicted, there's an overlap. We'll have a double description because I'm not going to repeat the various points that you made in terms of the arc, but I think the pattern that I was interested in was what I would distinguish, I think, as something that is intrinsic to the way I work. So I really have two questions for you as you're hearing what I say. Is, do you agree with what I've selected out as intrinsic to my work, which you've known over 50 years? And then second, does it in any way distinguish my work from any of the other couple therapy sessions that you've seen, in the course over time? So I think that one of the things that I do when couples are consulting me around illness is that in some subtle way, I establish that I am an expert on bodies right from the beginning, which I did by saying, are you going to be comfortable for 40 minutes? And so without having to ask who's the one with the illness experience, I say something that I'm sure no one has asked them before, and it does position me as somebody with expertise that they can trust me. The second, I think I am transparent about the work that I am doing in a very particular way, and that I use meta communication as the means by which I am transparent. So whenever I'm about to do a maneuver, that something that's a little out of the ordinary of regular flow of conversation, I meta communicate about it. And essentially I get permission before I go on. And, in a sewing metaphor, it's like I'm taking a stitch, realize that I'm going to move my needle in a different place. I backstitch, and I say, here's where I want to go. This is why. Is it going to be okay? And when you do that, almost always people say yes. And so I get to do the kind of maneuver with permission, even though it's about to be something that otherwise they might have found jarring. And the first place I do it is when Mark has opened and he's given me lots of material. And I say, I heard you, there's a lot there. And if it's all right with you, I'm going to turn to Jill. So that's an example where I'm transparent about what I'm about to do, but I am asking him permission, and I do it by meta communication. I think the third thing, and this is something you mentioned, is I'm pretty much always in my work blocking conversation that I know is well-trod area. So I'm not interested in hearing a conversation I know they've already had many, many times. And so in order to block it, I use that meta communication format, and I do two things. I say, I did hear it. I'm pretty sure you've had this conversation many times. I'm interested in new territory. Will that be okay? And again, almost always people say yes. Then I am very interested in imagery and metaphors, and believe that typically in a session, there might be 3 or 4 max that are richly evocative. And in this one, there were 2, and they both were Jill's. And the first one was the bubble of loneliness, and the second was I'm a big nobody. And both of those could be unpacked, which I think I did. And you mentioned that as well. But in order to do that, I think I not only slow the process down, but this is something that I hear in my work that I don't often hear in other people's, which is that I'm introducing time as something can happen in a moment that might not be able to happen over a longer swath of time, but could happen in a moment. So I'm reducing the time scale. And I say that in a number of ways, like you can't live here. Pragmatically, people can't live here, but maybe for just a moment. And I think that gives people motivation to do something because they're hearing, they don't have to do it forever. They don't even have to do it again, but just can they do it in this particular moment? And then, yes, I am listening for language that's connecting. And in this case, when she said, Mark said, I miss Jill. So I said, you miss Jill. And then I realized I could create a unifying construct. You miss Jill. Jill misses Jill. And then Jill was, as you said, I miss Jill. And then we had essentially for me, the interview is now the 3 of us are together from that point on in the interview. And then just the kind of last points I wanted to make were that the aspects of my published work that I think were very apparent in this interview, as you mentioned, intimacy. So that intimacy is about the sharing or co-creation of meaning, and that it can happen in the worst of times or the best of times. And at one point I say it can be hilarious to discover how awful something is. So that comes straight out of the work on intimate and non-intimate interaction. I think Mark's description of how he has behaved with Jill maps on to the witnessing model, every single one of the squares. He describes himself as frustrated. He describes himself as intrusive. He describes himself as withdrawing. He wants to be in the green square. And I want them both to be in the green square. But his just self-description maps on entirely onto the witnessing model. And of course, the most overarching construct of self-loss, other loss, is the dominant theme in this interview. And it's something, that I've written about it extensively. And then I do think that, again, the overarching point in the second half from the point of you miss Jill, Jill misses Jill. It's an instantiation of what is reasonable hope about, and what is the relationship of uncertainty to reasonable hope, and that's the paper that I have. So without explicitly naming any of those constructs, they inform how I listen, what I'm hearing, and then how I relate, what I'm trying to do. So anyway, that would be my kind of commentary. So my questions my questions are twofold. In what I just described, do you recognize that as a description of my work? And then is it exactly the same as everybody else? Or is there something that you would go, oh, if you heard an interview, but you didn't, or read a transcript of an interview and it didn't have my name on it, would you go, oh yeah, that's a Kaethe Weingarten interview?
Well, there are things that you do that other people do, and there are things you do that seem to be your signature things to the way you think. I think, blocking the old conversation and saying, I really did hear that. I want to get into new territory. Is that okay? And asking permission is not totally unique. A lot of people ask permission and meta communicate. So I've seen that, and I think it's a beautiful thing to be able to do, and it's a wonderful thing for new couple therapists to know as an option. So I think that's something that people can learn, that they can do, that they can talk about what they're doing and why they're doing it, and get buy-in or collaboration with people by asking people to come with them there. So I think that's a wonderful skill. I think that the naming was beautiful. And I think it's a narrative therapy thing. The fact that it's a metaphor or an image, I don't know if it's totally unique, but I think you picked up on it very quickly, the language of it. And I think that is a reflection of your own experience. The bubble of loneliness is something that I think very well is an illness experience. And the big nothing, the self-loss, other loss in the, I'm a big nothing is so reflective of this idea of self-loss. So that feels like the content of that is very resonant with your understanding and your experience of illness and what you've written about it. Something that can happen in a moment is interesting, because I know you wrote about that too. Moments count. And we often teach take a small step, because I think the same logic applies, right? If somebody can do a tiny thing in a direction, you're actually changing direction. And that even though it's a tiny thing, it's still a change in direction. And I think when you say something can happen in a moment, it does feel doable. Like maybe he can join her in a moment. And the idea that he never has to do it again, he doesn't have to do it forever. If it's scary, that you have a choice. But I remember you writing about that a long time ago. Maybe how many years ago did you write about that? 25 years ago? I don't know.
About 35, yeah.
Yeah, a long time ago. And I loved the part about I miss Jill. I think Jill misses Jill. Yes, I miss Jill. That was a beautiful moment. And I loved actually the way you just unpacked it, that now we're together in the interview. I didn't see it that way in terms of the meaning of it. I loved it, but I didn't quite see it as significant in terms of the flow of the interview, the way you just described. And I appreciate that. I think your ideas about intimacy and what is intimate interaction, and that it's a sharing of experience, which is a paper you wrote how many years ago?
30
years ago. And I remember at the time that it was very helpful to me to think about intimacy as, first of all, intimate interaction, and that it could be any shared experience, but it was the sharing. It was the resonance between two people of sharing the experience that made it feel intimate. And it broadens the notion of what intimacy is in a very helpful way for me, for everybody, I think, who is a therapist. This notion of the witnessing positions, as you said, that you didn't have to explicate it. You never needed to psychoeducate them about you could just hear that Mark was sometimes imposing, why don't you try antidepressants? That wasn't feeling like he was with Jill. Other times feeling totally lost and then withdrawing, and then he wasn't with her. And then I don't know, I'm getting some weird. Okay. And then that what the green square, the green is the good square, right? That's the so the green square, I just lost my
attuned. Yes, when they're attuned to each other. Yeah.
Was their attunement, right? And the mutual attunement, and the fact that, even from the beginning, you were building this notion of, are there ever times then you are together in this bubble, or are you in a bubble too? And he said no. And that you kind of built this idea that it was possible for him to be with her, that there was a way he could be with her without understanding what this illness was, without changing anything, without solving anything, that there was a way he could just be with her. And that felt to me like what compassionate witnessing is. And it's a huge opening, because the whole thing about illness, this illness and any illness, is what you described as, it's impossible to change it. So being able to be with is the best hope. And I thought that this, of course, connects to your paper on reasonable hope, which is in the background behind you. I don't know if you know.
No, I do. That's why it's there.
And the notion of uncertainty and the normalizing of uncertainty, that we don't think of it. And I think that's also unique to you, this notion of playing around with uncertainty.
Yeah, well, me and the Buddhist.
What?
Me and the Buddhists. It's not
you and the Buddhists. No, but I think, I remember when you talked about illness narratives, progressive.
Right, that's right.
And regressive. And I don't know what the middle one was, up and down. You never know, sort of chronically, whatever. And I just think that you've been thinking about illness and living with it and not knowing where it's going, and how that's a skill.
Right.
And I think that's that is unique from my perspective anyway. You're the person who has developed that idea and that, you say personal pain to public purpose, or
private pain to public purpose.
Yeah. So, I mean, to me, that is how you're making a gift of your experience.
Yeah, I mean, that's how I've organized my life. It's how I've distracted myself, right? Also.
And that's how you've allowed yourself to witness your own experience and be witnessed. You've allowed people to witness you, and you've looked at your experience and witnessed your experience through writing, through talking. So anyway, I loved this interview. I don't have more right now. I mean, I feel like I've said what I need to say. Do you feel like there's more you want to say?
No, there isn't. I mean, I feel very, very satisfied.
Okay, good. All right. Thank you, Kaethe.
I hope it'll be useful. Thank you.
I really thank you for coming to the class and for doing the interview and for us having this time together. Thank you.
Thank you.